She forgot the forks again, the older man at table 6 growled, just loud enough for the waitress to hear. His wife chuckled, shaking her head in mock disappointment. What can you expect from someone who probably didn't even finish high school? The words cut through Clara's chest like broken glass, each syllable a reminder of how far she had fallen from grace. Welcome back, and tell me what city you're watching from, or what time it is where you are. Enjoy this story that might just change how you see the world around you. The fluorescent lights of Murphy's family restaurant buzzed overhead like angry wasps, casting their harsh white glow across the red vinyl booths that had seen better decades. Clara Martinez wiped her hands on her stained apron, the same apron she'd been wearing for 3 months because she couldn't afford a replacement. Her fingers were cracked from washing dishes when the dishwasher called in sick, which happened more often than not. The smell of grease clung to her hair, her clothes, her very skin, no matter how many times she scrubbed herself raw in the shower of her rundown apartment. At 42, Clara moved through the restaurant with the practiced efficiency of someone who had learned to anticipate every need, every complaint, every cruel comment before it left a customer's lips. Her black shoes, bought second-hand and resoled twice, squeaked against the linoleum floor that never quite came clean despite her efforts with bleach and elbow grease. She carried herself with a quiet dignity that seemed to go unnoticed by everyone except the 7-year-old girl who waited for her every night in apartment 3B. Emily was the reason Clara smiled when her feet screamed in pain after 12-hour shifts. Emily was the reason she swallowed her pride when customers treated her like furniture with legs. Emily was the reason she had fled everything she once knew and loved, trading a life of respect for a life of survival in this small Illinois town where nobody asked questions about your past as long as you showed up to work. The dinner rush was in full swing, and table 6, the Hendersons, according to their reservation, had been testing Clara's patience since they walked through the door. Mr. Henderson wore a suit that probably cost more than Clara made in 3 months, while his wife's jewelry caught the light every time she gestured dismissively. Their teenage children sprawled across the booth with the entitled confidence of people who had never wondered where their next meal would come from. "Excuse me?" Mrs. Henderson's voice sliced through the ambient noise of clinking silverware and muffled conversations. "This water has spots on it. Don't you people know how to wash glasses properly?" Clara approached the table with a fresh glass, her trained smile masking the exhaustion that seemed to seep deeper into her bones with each passing day. "I'm so sorry about that, Ma'am. Let me get you a clean one right away." "You should be sorry," Mr. Henderson interjected, not bothering to look up from his phone. "For what we're paying for dinner, you'd think the service would be competent." The word competent hung in the air like a slap. Clara had heard it before, whispered behind her back by co-workers who assumed she couldn't understand English well enough to know they were discussing her mistakes. But Clara understood more than they could possibly imagine. She understood that competence was measured differently when you were desperate, when every shift meant the difference between keeping the lights on and sitting in darkness with your daughter. As she turned to fetch the clean glass, Clara caught her reflection in the restaurant's windows. The woman staring back at her seemed like a stranger. Hollow cheeks, hair pulled back in a utilitarian ponytail, eyes that had lost the spark they once held when she stood before lecture halls filled with eager students. Before the violence came, before everything changed in a single, terrifying night that split her life into before and after. The kitchen bell dinged, signaling that table 3's order was ready. Clara moved with mechanical precision, balancing plates on her arms the way she'd learned to balance syllabi and research papers in what felt like another lifetime. The muscle memory of grace remained, even when everything else had been stripped away. "Order up for table 3, she called softly to herself, a habit she'd developed to maintain some sense of control in a world that seemed determined to remind her of her powerlessness. The family at table 3 smiled when she approached, a genuine smile that caught her off guard. Sometimes kindness appeared in unexpected places, like flowers growing through cracks in concrete. But as she headed back toward the kitchen, she heard Mrs. Henderson's voice carrying across the restaurant with intentional volume. "I don't understand why restaurants hire people who can barely speak the language. It's like they don't even try to maintain standards anymore." The words found their mark with surgical precision. Clara's steps faltered for just a moment, a stumble so brief that most people wouldn't have noticed. But she noticed. Her body noticed. Her heart, which had been rebuilt so many times it felt held together with scar tissue, noticed. She continued walking, one foot in front of the other, past tables where families laughed over shared meals, past the window where she could see her own battered Honda Civic in the parking lot, the car that had carried her and Emily across 3 states to this place that promised nothing but demanded everything. In the kitchen, she allowed herself exactly 30 seconds to close her eyes and breathe. 30 seconds to remember the woman who once commanded respect through knowledge and wisdom, rather than begging for it through service. 30 seconds to feel the weight of the choice she'd made to keep Emily safe, no matter the cost to her own soul. When she opened her eyes, the cook, a kind man named Pete, who sometimes saved her the burnt pieces of bread that would otherwise be thrown away, was watching her with concern. "You all right, Clara?" She nodded, straightening her shoulders. "Fine, Pete. Just fine." But fine was a relative term when your world had been reduced to surviving one shift at a time, one cruel comment at a time, one day at a time. Fine was what you told people when the truth was too complicated and painful to explain. Fine was the armor she wore to protect the small flame of hope that still flickered somewhere deep inside, the hope that this was temporary, that tomorrow might offer something better for the daughter who believed her mother was the strongest woman in the world. The dinner rush continued around her, a symphony of demands and expectations that she met with quiet efficiency, carrying secrets in her heart that weighed more than any tray she'd ever lifted. Clara had been serving others long before she ever picked up a restaurant tray. In another life, in another country, she had served knowledge to eager minds who hung on her every word as she explained the intricate beauty of comparative linguistics. Dr. Clara Elena Martinez had been her name then, not just Clara, the waitress who couldn't remember which table ordered the extra ranch dressing. The university where she'd taught had marble corridors that echoed with scholarly discussions in a dozen different languages. Her office had been lined with books in Spanish, English, French, Arabic, Mandarin, and Russian, languages that flowed from her tongue like music, each one opening doorways to different worlds of thought and culture. Students would wait in line during her office hours, desperate for her insights on etymology and phonetic evolution. Her research on language acquisition in multilingual households had been published in prestigious journals, cited by colleagues across 3 continents. But that was before the death threats, before the midnight raids, before political violence had torn through her homeland like a hurricane, leaving intellectuals like herself with an impossible choice: stay and risk everything or flee and lose everything. She had chosen Emily's safety over her own identity, packing their lives into 2 suitcases and leaving behind 15 years of academic achievement, a home filled with family heirlooms and colleagues who had become like family. The decision to run had been made in the space between Emily's sleeping breaths, as Clara watched her daughter's peaceful face and knew she would sacrifice anything, her career, her dignity, her very sense of self, to keep that innocence safe. Now 6 months into her life as an invisible waitress in Murphy's family restaurant, Clara had become an expert in reading the subtle signs of customer dissatisfaction, the way Mrs. Peterson from table 4 would purse her lips when the coffee wasn't hot enough, the barely perceptible eye roll from the teenage boy at table 7 when she approached with his order, the way Mr. Henderson would deliberately look through her rather than at her when she asked if everything was satisfactory. "You're lucky we even let you work here," the assistant manager, Derek, had told her during her 2nd week when she'd accidentally mixed up 2 orders. He was barely 25, with acne scars and an attitude that seemed designed to compensate for his own insecurities. "Most places wouldn't hire someone with your situation, her situation." As if being an immigrant, a single mother, a woman starting over from nothing, was a character flaw rather than a circumstance forced upon her by forces beyond her control. Clara had nodded and apologized, swallowing the words that burned in her throat. Words about her doctorate, her publications, her ability to conduct academic discourse in 6 languages, while Derek struggled with basic English grammar. The other waitresses weren't intentionally cruel, but their casual dismissal cut just as deep. They would discuss weekend plans and family gatherings, while Clara cleaned tables nearby, speaking as if she weren't there, or wouldn't understand their references to local events and shared histories. When they did include her, it was with the patronizing kindness reserved for someone they assumed was intellectually inferior. "Clara, honey, do you need help reading the specials to table 12? Linda had asked just last week, speaking slowly and loudly, as if volume could bridge the gap she imagined existed between them. "Some of those words are pretty long," Clara had been reading Cervantes in the original Spanish, while Linda was still struggling with picture books, but she had simply smiled and shaken her head, accepting the offered help with grace she didn't feel. Every evening, the walk home through downtown Millerville took her past the local community college where night classes were taught in brightly lit rooms. Through the windows, she could see adult learners bent over textbooks, pursuing dreams of better futures through education. Sometimes she would pause on the sidewalk, remembering the feeling of standing before a classroom, of watching understanding dawn in a student's eyes, of being valued for her mind rather than her ability to remember who ordered the decaf. Her apartment was a testament to careful survival rather than living. The one-bedroom space she shared with Emily was clean but sparse, furnished with pieces from garage sales and the goodwill of strangers. The heater worked sporadically, leaving them to huddle together under every blanket they owned during the harsh Illinois winters. The refrigerator hummed with mechanical distress, keeping food cold through sheer determination rather than efficient operation. Emily had adapted to their reduced circumstances with the resilience that children possess, treating their shared bedroom like an adventure in cozy living. She did her homework at the kitchen table, while Clara counted tips and calculated which bills could wait another week. Emily never complained about wearing the same 3 outfits to school, or about the peanut butter sandwiches that had become their staple meal, or about the way her mother's hands smelled like bleach and disappointment, no matter how many times she washed them. "Mama, why do you look sad when you come home?" Emily had asked just last night, her 7-year-old eyes holding more wisdom than any child should possess. Clara had knelt down to Emily's level, smoothing her daughter's dark hair with fingers that trembled slightly from exhaustion. "I'm not sad, Mija. I'm just tired from working hard to take care of us. But your eyes look like they're crying, even when there aren't any tears." The observation had hit Clara with unexpected force, revealing how transparent her pain had become, despite her efforts to shield Emily from the daily humiliations that came with their new life. She wondered, for the first time since arriving in Millerville, if her sacrifice was teaching Emily the wrong lessons about a woman's worth in the world. Back at the restaurant, the Henderson family continued their evening performance of casual cruelty, each comment designed to establish their superiority over the woman who brought their food and cleaned their table. Mrs. Henderson complained about everything: the temperature of the soup, the texture of the bread, the speed of service, while her husband made loud observations about the help these days that were clearly intended for Clara's ears. Their teenage daughter, Sarah, seemed particularly pleased by her parents' behavior, giggling every time they made a disparaging comment about Clara's appearance or capabilities. At 16, Sarah had already learned that wealth could be wielded like a weapon against those who served you, that treating service workers with contempt was a privilege that came with her family's social status. "Honestly," Mrs. Henderson announced to her family, her voice carrying to nearby tables, "you'd think someone who can barely speak English would at least try to be more careful with the orders. It's like they don't understand that we're paying customers, not charity cases." Clara's hands tightened around the coffee pot she was carrying, her knuckles going white with the effort of maintaining her composure. The irony was crushing. She probably spoke English better than anyone in the Henderson family, with a vocabulary enriched by years of academic study and scholarly writing. But her accent, the slight softening of certain consonants that marked her as foreign, had apparently designated her as intellectually inferior in their minds. She had wondered, during the long nights when sleep eluded her, how long she could maintain this performance of grateful servitude. How many insults could she absorb before something inside her broke beyond repair? How many times could she smile and nod while customers questioned her intelligence, her worth, her very right to exist in their space? The answer, she was beginning to fear, was not much longer. The breaking point came on a Tuesday evening when the restaurant was packed beyond capacity and Clara had been on her feet for 11 straight hours. The Henderson family had requested her section specifically, not because they enjoyed her service, but because they had apparently decided she made for entertaining sport during their monthly family dinner. Clara approached their table with the carefully constructed smile she'd perfected over months of swallowing her dignity. "Can I get you anything else this evening?" "Actually, yes, Mr. Henderson said, leaning back in his chair with the satisfied expression of a man who'd just thought of something particularly clever. "My wife here was wondering, and please don't take this the wrong way, but were you actually educated wherever you come from?" I mean, do they have real schools there, or is it more like basic training for service work? The question hung in the air like a toxic cloud, spreading its poison to neighboring tables, where other diners pretended not to listen while obviously straining to hear Clara's response. Mrs. Henderson covered her mouth with her hand, feigning embarrassment while her eyes sparkled with malicious delight. Their teenage children exchanged glances and barely suppressed giggles. Clara felt something fundamental shift inside her chest, like tectonic plates moving after years of pressure. Her doctorate diploma was hanging in a frame in her apartment bedroom, not displayed proudly on a wall, but tucked away in a closet, because looking at it brought too much pain. Dr. Clara Elena Martinez, Ph.D. in Comparative Linguistics, Universidad Nacional, summa cum laude, published researcher, conference speaker, department head. She began, then stopped. What could she say? That she had spent 7 years writing her dissertation on phonetic evolution in Romance languages? That her research had been cited in textbooks these people's children were probably using in their expensive private schools? That she spoke more languages fluently than most people in this restaurant could name? See, Mrs. Henderson whispered loudly to her husband, I told you, they probably don't even have proper schools where she's from. Just look at her. She can't even answer a simple question about her education. Clara's vision blurred slightly around the edges. The coffee pot in her hand suddenly felt impossibly heavy, as if it were filled with lead rather than caffeine. She could feel the stares of other customers, could sense their mixture of curiosity and second-hand embarrassment. Some seemed uncomfortable with the Hendersons' behavior, but none moved to intervene. That's when Mrs. Henderson decided to deliver the final blow. You know what, dear, she said to her husband, her voice pitched to carry to the entire restaurant. I bet she worked as a maid back home too. Look at how naturally she takes orders. Some people are just born to serve, aren't they? It's probably for the best that she ended up here, instead of trying to do something she's not qualified for. The words hit Clara like physical blows, each one carefully aimed at the parts of her that she'd tried hardest to protect. The silence that followed was deafening, the kind of absolute quiet that falls over a room when something truly ugly has been exposed for everyone to see. Clara stood frozen, the coffee pot trembling in her hand. Tears burned behind her eyes, but she refused to let them fall. Not here. Not in front of these people who had already taken so much from her dignity. Around the restaurant, she could feel the weight of judgment and pity, could sense other customers deciding whether she deserved what was happening to her. A businessman at table 9 cleared his throat uncomfortably and looked away. A young couple near the window suddenly became very interested in their dessert menu. An elderly woman sitting alone made brief eye contact with Clara, and for a moment there was something like compassion in her gaze. But she too looked away when Mrs. Henderson's attention turned in her direction. Then came the accident that wasn't an accident. Mrs. Henderson reached for her water glass with a deliberate carelessness, knocking it directly into Clara's path. The glass shattered against the floor, sending ice water and broken crystal across Clara's already worn shoes and up her stockings. The cold liquid soaked through to her skin, but the physical discomfort was nothing compared to the hot shame that flooded her face. "Oh my goodness!" Mrs. Henderson gasped with theatrical concern. "How clumsy of me, although I have to say a good waitress would have seen that coming and moved out of the way. That's what training is for, isn't it?" Clara knelt down slowly, her knees protesting after hours of standing. Her hands shook as she began picking up pieces of broken glass, each shard reflecting the fluorescent lights above like tiny mirrors, showing her fragmented image back to herself. The water had soaked through her shoes to her socks, and she could feel the cold seeping into her bones. No one offered to help. No one brought her a towel or a broom. The Henderson family watched with the detached interest of people observing an ant farm, noting her movements with scientific curiosity rather than human compassion. As Clara gathered the larger pieces of glass, cutting her finger on one sharp edge, she heard Mrs. Henderson lean over to her husband and whisper, just loudly enough for Clara to hear, "You know, people like her only end up in places like this because they make bad life choices. If she'd stayed in school, applied herself, maybe learned to speak properly, she wouldn't be on her hands and knees cleaning up after decent people." That was the moment something inside Clara finally, irreversibly cracked. Not her heart. That had been broken so many times it had developed a protective scar tissue. Not her spirit. That had been bruised but somehow remained intact. What cracked was the careful wall she had built around her true self, the barrier that had allowed her to pretend that this humiliation was temporary, that she could endure anything as long as Emily was safe. She stood up slowly, a piece of glass still clutched in her bleeding hand. Her dark eyes, eyes that had once commanded respect from lecture halls full of graduate students, met Mrs. Henderson's pale blue ones with an intensity that made the older woman shift uncomfortably in her seat. "I need to get something to clean this up properly," Clara said quietly, her accented English suddenly sounding less like a liability and more like evidence of the complex life she had lived before this moment. As she walked toward the kitchen, she passed the hostess station, where a police officer sat eating his dinner, Officer James Mitchell, who came in every Tuesday evening after his shift. He looked up as she passed, noting the glass in her hand and the water stains on her uniform. "Ma'am, are you all right?" he asked, his voice carrying the kind of genuine concern that Clara hadn't heard directed at her in months. Clara paused, looking at this man who saw her as a person rather than furniture. For the first time in weeks, she stood a little straighter. "I think," she said slowly, "I'm about to be." In that silence that followed, something inside her cracked, but it wasn't weakness. It was the beginning of truth. Word of the Henderson family's behavior spread through the restaurant like spilled water, reaching every corner where staff and customers processed what they had witnessed. The reactions revealed the true character of everyone present, dividing the room into those who looked away in shame and those who leaned in with curiosity. Derek, the assistant manager, materialized beside the Henderson table with the practiced smoothness of someone accustomed to managing difficult situations. His primary concern wasn't Clara's dignity. It was ensuring that paying customers remained satisfied customers. "I'm so sorry about this incident," he said to Mr. Henderson, his voice dripping with the kind of apologetic deference reserved for people who spent significant money in his establishment. "Please allow me to comp your entire meal tonight, and I'll make sure you have a different server for the rest of the evening." Mrs. Henderson accepted this offer with regal graciousness, as if she were conferring a favor rather than receiving compensation for her own cruelty. "Well, that's very considerate of you. I have to say it's refreshing to see management that actually cares about customer service standards." At table 12, an elderly couple exchanged uncomfortable glances. The woman, Mrs. Eleanor Park, had watched the entire scene unfold with growing distress. She had immigrated to America from South Korea 50 years earlier and recognized something familiar in Clara's careful composure under attack. Her husband, however, seemed more concerned with avoiding involvement than addressing injustice. "We should say something," she whispered to him in Korean. "Don't get involved," he responded in the same language. "It's not our business." But Mrs. Park couldn't shake the image of Clara on her knees, gathering broken glass while absorbing insults that cut deeper than any physical wound. She had been that woman once, educated, accomplished, reduced to taking whatever work would pay the bills, while strangers questioned her intelligence based on her accent. At table 9, the businessman who had looked away earlier was wrestling with his own conscience. David Chen was a successful accountant whose own parents had worked in restaurants when they first arrived from Taiwan. He knew exactly what Clara was experiencing, but the comfort of his current social position made intervention feel risky. What if speaking up made things worse? What if the Hendersons were clients of his firm? What if standing up for a waitress somehow reflected poorly on his professional judgment? The young couple near the window, Jessica and Mike, were having their own whispered debate. They were both grad students surviving on scholarships and part-time jobs, and they understood economic vulnerability in ways that made Clara's situation feel uncomfortably familiar. "This is disgusting," Jessica murmured. "Someone needs to say something." "What are we supposed to do?" Mike replied. "We can barely afford our own dinner. You want to start a fight with people who obviously have money and connections." But it was 7-year-old Lily Martinez at table 15 who provided the most honest reaction. She was having dinner with her grandmother when she witnessed the glass incident, and her young voice cut through the adult pretense with devastating clarity. "Abuela, why are those people being mean to the lady?" she asked in Spanish, loud enough for several tables to hear. Her grandmother quickly shushed her, but the child's question hung in the air like an accusation, highlighting the moral cowardice that allowed cruelty to flourish in civilized spaces. Officer Mitchell had been observing the entire scene with the trained eye of someone accustomed to reading human behavior. He had dealt with domestic disputes, public disturbances, and countless situations where power imbalances led to abuse. What he was witnessing at the Henderson table followed a familiar pattern, the strong targeting the vulnerable, secure in the knowledge that their position protected them from consequences. As Clara returned from the kitchen with cleaning supplies, Officer Mitchell made a decision that would change everything. He stood up from his table and approached her with the quiet authority that came from years of protecting people who couldn't protect themselves. "Excuse me, miss," he said, his voice carrying just enough to be heard by nearby tables. "Aren't you the woman who called in the witness report last week about the hit-and-run accident on Main Street?" Clara stopped, confusion evident in her eyes. She hadn't called in any report. She didn't even own a phone that could make such calls reliably. But something in Officer Mitchell's expression told her to listen carefully. I'm not sure what you mean," she said slowly. "The report about the blue sedan that hit the cyclist and fled the scene. The caller provided a description in multiple languages to make sure our dispatcher understood every detail correctly. We've been trying to track down that witness to thank them. It was the most comprehensive report we'd received in years." A hush fell over the nearby tables. Mrs. Henderson's conversation with Derek trailed off as she strained to hear what was happening. The Henderson children, who had been giggling moments earlier, now sat silent and attentive. Officer Mitchell continued, his voice growing slightly louder. "The caller spoke to our dispatcher in English, Spanish, and I believe French as well. Our captain was amazed by how precisely she communicated the details. Said it was the kind of witness statement that prosecutors dream about. Clear, accurate, and completely credible." Clara's mind raced as she began to understand what was happening. This kind officer was creating an opportunity for her, building a foundation for truth that went far beyond the immediate moment. "I speak several languages," she said quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. "Several?" Officer Mitchell repeated, raising his eyebrows with genuine interest. "How many, if you don't mind me asking?" Clara looked around the restaurant, suddenly aware that every conversation had stopped. The Henderson family was staring at her with expressions ranging from confusion to dawning concern. Mrs. Henderson's confident smirk was beginning to falter as she sensed a shift in the evening's narrative. "6," Clara said, her voice growing stronger. "English, Spanish, French, Arabic, Mandarin, and Russian." The silence that followed was profound and electric. Mrs. Henderson's face had gone pale, while her husband's expression shifted from smug superiority to uncomfortable uncertainty. Their teenagers looked between their parents and Clara with the dawning awareness that they might have seriously misjudged the situation. Officer Mitchell nodded approvingly. 6 languages, that's remarkable. You know, the police department is always looking for qualified interpreters and cultural liaisons. Someone with your linguistic abilities could be incredibly valuable in our community outreach programs. Derek, who had been preparing to smoothly remove Clara from the Henderson's sightline, now found himself reassessing the woman he had dismissed as merely another desperate immigrant. His mental calculations were shifting, considering the possibility that he might have misunderstood exactly who Clara was and what she brought to his establishment. Mrs. Park finally found her courage. She stood up from her table and walked over to Clara with the determined stride of someone who had decided that silence was no longer an option. "Excuse me," she said to Clara in perfect English that still carried traces of her Korean heritage. "I couldn't help but overhear. Are you by any chance educated in linguistics?" Clara's eyes widened at this unexpected question from a stranger. Yes, I have a background in comparative linguistics." "A background?" Mrs. Park pressed gently. "Or formal training?" The question hung in the air like a challenge, demanding truth in a space that had been dominated by assumptions and prejudice. Clara stood at the center of attention, holding cleaning supplies in her bleeding hand, wearing a stained uniform that had become a costume she'd been forced to inhabit. For the first time in months, she lifted her chin and spoke with the voice that had once commanded lecture halls and academic conferences. "I have a doctorate in comparative linguistics from Universidad Nacional," she said clearly. "I was a professor and department head for 15 years before I came to this country." The words fell into the silence like stones into still water, sending ripples of shock and embarrassment across the room. Mrs. Henderson's mouth opened and closed without sound, while her husband's face reddened with the fury of a man who realized he had been made a fool. But the story was far from over. In fact, it was just beginning. The revelation that Clara held a doctorate hit the restaurant like a thunderclap, transforming the atmosphere from casual dinner conversation to electric tension. Mrs. Henderson's face cycled through multiple shades of red and white as she processed the implications of what she had just learned. Her husband's jaw worked silently, searching for words that could somehow undo the profound embarrassment of having publicly mocked a woman whose educational credentials far exceeded his own. But instead of apologizing or retreating, the Henderson family chose to double down on their cruelty with the desperate aggression of people whose worldview was crumbling in real time. A doctorate! Mrs. Henderson's laugh came out as a harsh bark. From where exactly? Some diploma mill that hands out degrees to anyone who can pay the fees? That doesn't mean anything here. This isn't whatever third world country you crawled out of. Her words cut through the restaurant like broken glass, causing several patrons to gasp audibly. Even Derek, whose primary loyalty was to customer satisfaction, looked uncomfortable with the venomous turn the conversation had taken. Mr. Henderson leaned forward, his voice dripping with condescension. Look, sweetheart, I don't care what piece of paper you think you have. You're here in this uniform serving my family dinner. That tells me everything I need to know about the real value of your so-called education. Their teenage daughter, Sarah, emboldened by her parents' example, added her own cruelty. Besides, if you were actually smart, you wouldn't be working as a waitress. Smart people don't end up in dead-end jobs serving other people. They make something of themselves. Each word landed like a physical blow, but something had fundamentally changed in Clara. The careful wall she had built around her dignity was crumbling, but instead of exposing vulnerability, it was revealing the steel core that had carried her through years of academic challenges, political persecution, and the impossible journey to build a new life from nothing. Clara stood motionless for what felt like eternity, the broken glass still scattered around her feet, the cleaning supplies forgotten in her hands. The restaurant seemed to hold its collective breath, waiting to see if she would crumble under the weight of such calculated cruelty, or find some reserve of strength that even she didn't know existed. When she finally moved, it was with deliberate precision. She set down the cleaning supplies piece by piece, as if each action carried enormous significance. When she straightened up, there was something fundamentally different in her posture. The ghost of the professor she had once been was beginning to reassert itself through the waitress uniform. The transformation was subtle but unmistakable. Her shoulders squared, her chin lifted. Her dark eyes, which had been trained downward in subservience for months, now looked directly at the Henderson family with an intensity that made them shift uncomfortably in their seats. "You want to know about my education," she said, her voice growing stronger with each word, the careful accent that she'd been taught to minimize suddenly sounding like evidence of the complex life she had lived rather than a mark of shame. "Mrs." Henderson opened her mouth to deliver another cutting remark, but something in Clara's bearing stopped her. For the first time that evening, she seemed to sense that she might have underestimated her target. "I wrote my doctoral dissertation on phonetic evolution in Romance languages," Clara continued, her voice carrying across the silent restaurant with the authority of someone accustomed to commanding lecture halls. "It was published by Universidad Nacional Press and has been cited in linguistic journals across 3 continents. I spent 7 years researching how language changes when cultures collide, studying exactly the kind of linguistic adaptation I've been forced to live through." The words fell into the silence like stones into still water, sending ripples of shock across the room. "Mrs." Henderson's confident smirk began to falter as she realized that her assumptions about Clara's background were not just wrong, but spectacularly, humiliatingly wrong. "I spoke at conferences in Madrid, Paris, and Montreal," Clara continued, her voice gaining strength from the simple act of speaking truth after months of silence. "I trained graduate students who are now professors themselves. I published research that contributed to our understanding of how human beings communicate across cultural boundaries." Officer Mitchell watched with growing admiration as Clara reclaimed her identity piece by piece. Mrs. Parks smiled with the recognition of someone who understood exactly what it cost to rebuild yourself in a new country. Even Derek stood frozen, his mental calculations shifting as he tried to reconcile the woman he had dismissed as lucky to have any job with the accomplished academic standing before him. But Clara wasn't finished. The dam had broken, and months of suppressed dignity came flooding out. "I am fluent in 6 languages, not because I memorized phrases from a tourist guidebook, but because I spent 15 years studying the intricate beauty of how human beings create meaning through sound and structure. When I speak to you in English, I'm doing so with a vocabulary shaped by years of academic research and scholarly writing. When you mock my accent, you're hearing the evidence of a mind that can navigate complex grammatical systems that most monolingual speakers can't even imagine. The Henderson family sat in stunned silence, their evening of casual cruelty having transformed into a public humiliation that they had brought entirely upon themselves. Mrs. Henderson's jewelry suddenly looked gaudy rather than elegant, and her husband's expensive suit couldn't disguise the smallness of his character. Clara looked around the restaurant, making eye contact with every person who had witnessed her humiliation, and was now witnessing something far more powerful, a woman reclaiming her worth. "You asked me why I'm here, in this uniform, if I'm actually educated," she said, her voice now carrying a weight that commanded absolute attention. "The answer is simple, and it has nothing to do with my intelligence, my qualifications, or my worth as a human being." She paused, letting the silence stretch until every person in the restaurant was leaning forward, desperate to hear what came next. "I'm here because sometimes the world forces impossible choices on people, and I chose my daughter's life over my professional pride. But that choice doesn't make me less intelligent. It makes me a mother." In that moment, as Clara stood surrounded by broken glass but no longer broken herself, something irreversible had shifted. The invisible waitress had become impossible to ignore. The silence that followed Clara's declaration stretched across the restaurant like a held breath, heavy with the weight of revealed truths and shattered assumptions. Mrs. Henderson's face had gone ashen, her mouth opening and closing soundlessly as she struggled to find words that could somehow restore her diminished position. Her husband sat rigid in his chair, his expensive suit suddenly looking like a costume rather than a symbol of success. But it was their teenage daughter Sarah who broke first, her young voice cracking with something that might have been the beginning of conscience. "Mom, maybe we should just—" "Shut up, Sarah," Mrs. Henderson snapped, her voice sharp with desperation. She turned back to Clara with the fury of someone whose carefully constructed superiority had been exposed as hollow. "I don't care what sob story you're trying to sell. The fact remains that you're here serving us, which means whatever you claim to have been doesn't matter anymore." Her words hung in the air like poison, but they no longer had the power to wound Clara the way they had moments before. Something fundamental had shifted in the restaurant's ecosystem, and Mrs. Henderson seemed to be the only person who hadn't realized it yet. Officer Mitchell stepped forward, his presence commanding immediate attention. His uniform carried weight in ways that Mrs. Henderson's jewelry and designer clothes never could, representing real authority rather than purchased status. "Actually, ma'am," he said, his voice carrying the calm professionalism of someone accustomed to de-escalating volatile situations, "I think you might be interested to know that the police department has been looking for someone with Dr. Martinez's qualifications for quite some time." The formal title landed like a thunderclap. Dr. Martinez. Not Clara the waitress, not the woman whose English supposedly needed improvement, but Dr. Martinez, a title that carried the weight of years of study, research, and academic achievement. Mrs. Henderson's eyes widened with alarm. "Doctor? She's not a real doctor. She's a waitress." "A doctor of linguistics, yes," Officer Mitchell continued, consulting a small notebook he'd pulled from his pocket with theatrical precision. "We've had several cases recently where having someone who could communicate fluently with witnesses and victims in multiple languages would have been invaluable. Just last month we had a domestic violence case where the victim only spoke Mandarin, and we struggled to get an accurate statement through interpreters who weren't available for hours." He looked directly at Clara with respectful interest. "Dr. Martinez, would you mind if I asked about your experience with simultaneous interpretation? We've been considering creating a civilian consultant position for exactly this kind of linguistic support." The transformation in the room's atmosphere was palpable. Suddenly, Clara wasn't the object of pity or contempt. She was a sought-after professional whose skills were needed and valued. The Henderson family sat in stunned silence as they watched their evening's entertainment transform into their evening's humiliation. Mrs. Park, the elderly Korean woman who had spoken up earlier, approached Clara with tears in her eyes. "Dr. Martinez," she said, using the title with obvious respect, "I want to apologize for not speaking up sooner. I know what it's like to have your credentials questioned, to have people assume you're less intelligent because of your accent. I should have said something when they were treating you so poorly. She reached into her purse and pulled out a business card. I'm Eleanor Park, retired Dean of International Studies at the Community College. We've been desperately trying to find qualified faculty for our ESL and multicultural programs. Would you consider meeting with me to discuss a teaching position? The dominoes continued to fall. David Chen, the businessman who had looked away earlier, stood up from his table and walked over with visible shame on his face. Dr. Martinez, I owe you an apology. I watched what was happening and did nothing to intervene. That was cowardly of me. He pulled out his own card. I'm an accountant, and several of my clients are international businesses looking for cultural consultants who can help with multilingual communications. If you're interested, I'd like to help connect you with opportunities that actually value your expertise. Derek, the assistant manager, who had been prepared to remove Clara from the Hendersons' sightline to protect his precious customers, now found himself in the awkward position of trying to salvage his restaurant's reputation. Dr. Martinez, he said, his voice heavy with the kind of regret that comes from realizing you've badly misjudged a situation. I had no idea about your background. Perhaps we could discuss a different role here, maybe helping us better serve our diverse customer base. But Clara shook her head gently. Thank you, Derek, but I think my time here is coming to an end. Mrs. Henderson, watching her evening's power structure completely collapse, made one final desperate attempt to regain control. This is ridiculous, she declared, her voice rising with hysteria. You're all being taken in by some elaborate story. Look at her, look at where she is. If she was really some kind of professor, she wouldn't be working in a place like this. Her words echoed across the restaurant, but instead of finding support, they were met with uncomfortable stares and obvious disapproval. Even her own family seemed to be distancing themselves from her increasingly desperate rhetoric. That's when 7-year-old Lily Martinez at table 15 stood up on her chair and addressed the room with the moral clarity that only children possess. Abuela, she said to her grandmother in Spanish, then switched to perfect English. The mean lady is wrong. My teacher says that people can be smart and poor at the same time, and good people help each other instead of being mean. Her words cut through the adult complexities and pretenses, reducing the situation to its essential moral components: kindness versus cruelty, dignity versus arrogance, human worth versus economic status. Clara looked around the restaurant at the faces surrounding her, some ashamed, some supportive, some still processing the complete reversal they had witnessed. For the first time in months, she felt seen not as a problem to be managed or an obstacle to be tolerated, but as a person whose presence had value. Officer Mitchell closed his notebook and looked directly at Mrs. Henderson. Ma'am, I think it might be best if you and your family settled your bill and called it an evening. The management here clearly has some personnel decisions to make, and Dr. Martinez has some opportunities to consider. Mrs. Henderson's mouth worked silently, her face cycling through shades of red and white, as she realized that her position as the evening's dominant force had been completely undermined. The power she had wielded so casually over Clara had evaporated, leaving her exposed as exactly what she was, a small person made smaller by her own cruelty. As the Henderson family gathered their belongings in humiliated silence, Clara stood surrounded by people who were offering her respect, opportunity, and hope. The broken glass was still scattered around her feet, but she was no longer the broken person who had knelt to clean it up. The invisible waitress had become impossible to ignore, and the ripple effects of her transformation were only just beginning. 3 weeks later, Clara Elena Martinez walked through the doors of Murphy's family restaurant for the last time, not as an employee, but as a customer. The transformation was visible in every detail: the tailored navy blazer that replaced her stained uniform, the confident stride that had replaced her hurried scurrying, the way she held her head high instead of keeping her eyes downcast in practiced subservience. Emily skipped beside her, wearing a new dress that Clara had been able to buy without calculating whether it meant they would eat less that week. The 7-year-old's excitement was infectious as she pointed out details of the restaurant to her mother, as if seeing it for the first time through different eyes. "Is that where the mean people sat, Mama?" Emily asked in Spanish, pointing to the booth where the Henderson family had delivered their cruelty. "Yes, Mija," Clara replied, switching to English with deliberate pride. "But we're not here because of them. We're here to say goodbye to the good people who work here." The lunch crowd was lighter than the dinner rush, Clara remembered, giving her space to process the strange sensation of returning to a place where she had been invisible as someone who now commanded attention and respect. Several customers recognized her from the local newspaper article that had run the previous week. Local restaurant waitress revealed as linguistic expert, offered multiple professional positions. Pete, the kind cook who had saved her burnt bread during her hungriest nights, emerged from the kitchen with tears in his eyes when he saw her. "Dr. Martinez," he said, using her title with obvious pride. "Look at you. Just look at you." They embraced with the warmth of people who had shared difficult circumstances and emerged into better ones. Pete had been one of the few staff members who had treated Clara with consistent kindness, and his joy at her transformation felt genuine and earned. "I brought you something," Clara said, handing him a small wrapped package. Inside was a leather-bound notebook filled with her handwritten recipes, traditional dishes from her homeland that she had adapted to available ingredients during her months of poverty. "These are some of my grandmother's recipes, along with notes about ingredient substitutions when you can't afford the authentic versions. I thought you might enjoy trying them." Pete accepted the gift with reverence, understanding that he was receiving something precious and personal. "This means more to me than you know," he said quietly. Derek approached cautiously, his usual swagger replaced by obvious discomfort. The assistant manager, who had once dismissed Clara as lucky to have any job, now found himself in the awkward position of addressing someone whose professional credentials far exceeded his own. "Dr. Martinez," he said, stumbling slightly over the title. "I want to apologize again for how I treated you. I should have taken the time to get to know you as a person, instead of making assumptions." Clara looked at him with the measured assessment of someone who had learned to read people's sincerity through months of navigating false kindness and genuine cruelty. Derek's regret seemed real, but it was the regret of someone who was sorry for being caught in his prejudices rather than sorry for holding them in the first place. "Thank you for the apology, Derek," she said diplomatically. "I hope this experience helps you treat future employees with more consideration for their full humanity." Her response was gracious but distant, offering forgiveness without absolution. Derek nodded and retreated, understanding that some bridges, once burned, could not be rebuilt with simple words. The booth where Mrs. Henderson had held court was occupied by a young family with 2 small children who were laughing over shared jokes and treating their waitress with natural courtesy. The contrast was stark and somehow healing, evidence that cruelty was a choice rather than an inevitable human response to service relationships. Clara and Emily settled into a corner booth, and Clara experienced the surreal pleasure of being served by Linda, the waitress who had once offered to help her read difficult words to customers. Linda's demeanor had changed completely. Where once there had been patronizing kindness, there was now obvious respect tinged with embarrassment. "Dr. Martinez," Linda said, her voice carefully formal, "it's wonderful to see you again. What can I get for you and your daughter today?" "Just Clara is fine," she replied gently, understanding that Linda was struggling with her own recognition of how badly she had misjudged the situation. "And we'll have the grilled chicken salad and a chocolate milk for Emily, please." As Linda walked away to place their order, Emily looked around the restaurant with the analytical attention she had inherited from her academic mother. "Mama, why are people acting so different now? Before they barely looked at you. Now they seem nervous." Clara considered her daughter's question carefully, wanting to provide an answer that was honest without being bitter. "Sometimes, Mija, people judge others based on what they can see on the surface. Clothes, jobs, accents, instead of taking time to understand who someone really is. When they realize they were wrong, they feel embarrassed. But you're the same person you always were," Emily pointed out with 7-year-old logic. "Exactly," Clara smiled. "I'm the same person. The only thing that changed is that now they know what I've always known about myself." Officer Mitchell appeared at their table, still in uniform but clearly on a break. His presence had become a source of comfort rather than concern, a reminder that authority could be used to protect rather than intimidate. "Dr. Martinez, Emily," he said, settling into the booth with the easy familiarity of someone who had become a friend. "How are you settling into the new apartment?" "It's wonderful," Emily answered, before her mother could respond. "My room has a window that looks out on the garden, and Mama has space for all her books again, and the heater works all the time." Clara laughed at her daughter's enthusiasm, remembering the cramped, cold apartment where they had huddled together under blankets. The new place was modest but warm, located within walking distance of both the community college, where Clara had started teaching ESL classes, and the police station, where she worked part-time as a cultural liaison and interpreter. "The department is already talking about expanding the program," Officer Mitchell told her. "Last week alone, your interpretations helped us properly interview 3 witnesses and 1 victim who wouldn't have been able to communicate effectively otherwise. You're making a real difference." Clara felt a warmth that had nothing to do with the restaurant's temperature. For the first time in months, her work was valued for its intellectual content rather than her willingness to accept mistreatment. She was using her mind, her education, her linguistic skills to help people, exactly what she had trained for years to do. Mrs. Park approached their table, her smile radiant with the satisfaction of someone who had helped orchestrate a positive outcome. "Clara, dear, I have wonderful news. The College Board approved the funding for a full-time position in our International Studies program. The job is yours if you want it. Full benefits, decent salary, and the opportunity to develop curriculum that reflects your expertise." The offer represented everything Clara had hoped for, but hadn't dared to expect. Professional respect, financial security, and the chance to rebuild her academic career in a new country. Emily squeezed her mother's hand under the table, understanding even at 7 that this was a moment of profound importance. "I accept," Clara said simply, her voice carrying the quiet confidence of someone who had rediscovered her worth. As they finished their meal in the restaurant where Clara had once scrubbed floors and absorbed insults, she marveled at how dramatically circumstances could change when people were forced to see beyond their initial assumptions. She was the same woman who had knelt to pick up broken glass while customers questioned her intelligence, but now those same people had to reconcile their prejudices with the reality of her accomplishments. The transformation wasn't magical, it was the natural result of truth finally being allowed to surface, after months of being buried under economic desperation and social invisibility. Clara had always been Dr. Eleanor Martinez, accomplished linguist and dedicated educator. The only thing that had changed was that the world had finally been forced to acknowledge what had always been true. As they prepared to leave, Emily tugged on her mother's sleeve. "Mama, are we rich now?" Clara knelt down to her daughter's level, smoothing Emily's dark hair with hands that no longer smelled of industrial bleach and defeat. "We're not rich in money yet, baby, but we are rich in everything that matters. We have dignity, opportunity, and people who value us for who we truly are." Outside the restaurant, their car, still the same aging Honda Civic, but now clean and well-maintained, waited to take them to their new life. As they drove away, Clara looked in the rearview mirror at the building where she had learned that human worth could survive even the cruelest attempts to diminish it. The invisible waitress had become impossible to ignore, and her story was just beginning. 6 months after that transformative evening at Murphy's family restaurant, Dr. Clara Elena Martinez stood before a lecture hall filled with students at Millerville Community College, her voice carrying the same authority and passion that had once commanded respect in universities across continents. The classroom was alive with the energy of engaged learning, students from diverse backgrounds hanging on every word as she explained the intricate beauty of language evolution. "When cultures collide," she told her multicultural students, many of whom were immigrants themselves, "language doesn't simply change, it becomes a bridge between worlds. Every accent you hear, every grammatical structure that seems different, represents a human story of adaptation and survival." In the front row, a young woman from Somalia raised her hand. "Professor Martinez, when people criticize my English, how do I respond?" Clara smiled, remembering the weight of similar wounds. "You remind them that speaking multiple languages is a sign of intelligence, not deficiency. You remind them that your accent carries the evidence of a complex life lived across cultures, and most importantly, you never let their limitations define your worth." After class, Clara walked to her office at the college where she served as both professor and coordinator of the new Immigrant Services program. Her modest office was bright with afternoon sunlight, decorated with thank you letters from students and certificates of recognition from community organizations. On her desk sat a framed photo of Emily receiving an academic achievement award at school, both of them smiling radiantly, representing the life they had built together from nothing. The transformation had been gradual, but profound. Clara's salary from teaching, combined with her part-time work as a police consultant, had allowed them to move into a comfortable apartment with heat that worked and windows that let in light. Emily had her own bedroom, filled with books in both English and Spanish, and a small garden where they grew herbs that reminded Clara of home. More importantly, Clara had rediscovered the person she had been forced to hide for so many months. Her confidence had returned naturally as she found herself valued for her mind, her expertise, her ability to bridge cultures and languages in ways that truly helped people. She woke up each morning excited about the day ahead, rather than dreading another shift of humiliation and poverty. Emily knocked on her office door, backpack slung over her shoulder, ready for their walk home together. At 8 years old now, she had grown into the kind of child who asked thoughtful questions about the world and showed genuine kindness to classmates who struggled with English or felt different from their peers. "Mama, can we stop by Murphy's tonight?" Emily asked as they walked through campus. "I want to see Pete and give him the drawing I made of his garden." Clara smiled at her daughter's request. They had developed a tradition of visiting the restaurant once a month, maintaining connections with the people who had shown them kindness during their darkest period. Pete had become like family, always saving them a special dessert and asking about Emily's school progress. The restaurant looked exactly the same from the outside, but Clara's relationship with the space had been completely transformed. Where once she had dreaded walking through those doors, knowing that another shift of degradation awaited her, she now entered as a respected member of the community, greeted with genuine warmth by staff and customers alike. Pete emerged from the kitchen the moment he saw them, his weathered face lighting up with grandfatherly affection. "Dr. Martinez, Emily, perfect timing. I just finished experimenting with one of your grandmother's recipes. You have to try the flan." As they settled into a booth, Clara marveled at how different the space felt when viewed through the lens of dignity rather than desperation. The same fluorescent lights that had once seemed harsh now provided cheerful illumination. The same red vinyl booths that had witnessed her humiliation now hosted conversations filled with respect and friendship. Derek approached their table cautiously, his demeanor still marked by the shame of his past behavior. Over the months, he had made genuine efforts to change the restaurant's culture, implementing sensitivity training for staff and establishing clear policies against customer harassment of employees. "Dr. Martinez," he said respectfully, "I wanted to let you know that we received approval for the scholarship program we discussed. The first Dr. Clara Martinez Educational Excellence Award will be presented next month to a local immigrant student pursuing higher education." Clara accepted the news graciously, understanding that the restaurant was trying to transform a place of pain into a source of positive change. The scholarship wouldn't erase what had happened to her, but it might prevent someone else from experiencing the same degradation. Mrs. Park joined them for dinner, as had become their monthly tradition. The elderly woman had become more than a colleague. She was a mentor, friend, and surrogate grandmother to Emily. Her presence in their lives represented the kind of supportive community that Clara had thought might never exist for them again. "I have news," Mrs. Park announced with obvious excitement. "The University of Illinois Chicago called again today. They're not just offering you an interview anymore. They're offering you a full professorship with tenure track. The department head said your work with immigrant communities here has become a model they want to replicate on a larger scale." Clara felt a familiar flutter of possibility mixed with uncertainty. The opportunity represented everything she had dreamed of rebuilding: major university research, advanced students, the chance to contribute to scholarly discourse at the highest levels. But it also meant leaving the community that had embraced her, the students who looked to her as proof that starting over was possible. "What do you think, Misha?" she asked Emily, who had been listening to the adult conversation with typical seriousness. "I think," Emily said carefully, "that we should go where you can help the most people and be the happiest. And maybe Chicago has other kids who need to know that being different can be beautiful." Clara's heart swelled with pride at her daughter's wisdom and generosity. Emily had learned from their experience not bitterness or fear, but empathy and resilience. She understood that their story wasn't just about their own survival, but about what they could offer to others facing similar struggles. As they finished dinner and prepared to leave, Clara looked around the restaurant one more time, remembering the woman who had knelt to pick up broken glass while strangers questioned her worth. That woman had been the same person sitting here now, intelligent, educated, capable, deserving of respect. The only thing that had changed was that the world had finally been forced to see what had always been true. Walking home through the familiar streets of Millerville, Emily slipped her hand into her mother's. "Mama, are we rich now?" Clara squeezed her daughter's hand gently, thinking about the apartment filled with books, the career that challenged and fulfilled her, the community that valued their contributions, the future that sparkled with possibility. "We're not rich in money yet, baby," she said, echoing words she had spoken months earlier in very different circumstances. "But we are rich in everything that matters. We have dignity, opportunity, and people who see us for who we truly are." They walked in comfortable silence, mother and daughter, survivors who had discovered that human worth could not be destroyed by cruelty or poverty or the assumptions of others. Clara had learned that dignity was not something that could be granted or taken away by external circumstances. It was something that came from within, something that could survive even the darkest periods and emerge stronger when given the chance to flourish. Behind them, the lights of Murphy's family restaurant glowed in the distance, no longer a symbol of degradation, but a reminder that transformation was always possible, that invisible people could become impossible to ignore, and that sometimes the most broken moments could become the foundation for the most beautiful comebacks. True worth, Clara had learned, could never be hidden forever, and sometimes the people the world steps on come back to lift it higher than anyone ever imagined. The invisible waitress had become a beacon of hope, and her story would inspire others for years to come. Have you ever experienced something similar, or do you know someone who has faced this kind of prejudice and found the strength to rise above it? If this story touched your heart, please leave a like and subscribe. It really helps spread this important message of dignity and resilience. Congratulations. Type 9 in the comments so that I know you stayed until the end with me. Thank you for watching.